Hi folks, this is International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and today we'll be doing a lesson on blunders. Specifically, I'll be going into the different types of blunders that exist in chess, and I'll also be showing you guys tips and techniques to avoid blunders in your games. Now, the first point I want to make is that blunders do happen to chess players of all levels. That means from the very bottom all the way to the highest and most elite levels. And that's why I wanted to start off with the example in front of you right now. Some of you probably recognize this game. This took place from the second World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Vishy Anand. Here playing white, Magnus has just made the move King d2. And this move was a pretty egregious tactical blunder for someone of Magnus's level, who, as you know, has been the #1 player for many years now and is well over 2800. And here, Black has a winning tactic that Anand actually failed to see. The winning move was knight takes e5. And this move is based on a few tactical elements. The first is that White's rook on g4 is currently hanging, which means that if White plays rook takes e5, he'll simply lose the rook on g4. The second is that the pawn on c4 is also hanging, and this pawn is hanging with check, meaning that after White plays rook takes g8, Black doesn't recapture the rook on g8. This would allow White to play rook takes e5, but Black throws in the in-between move, knight takes c4. White has to play king d3, and another in-between move, knight b2 check. And now the king can't move anywhere to continue attacking this knight, so after the king moves away, Black recaptures the rook on g8, and now Black has 2 extra pawns. And this was based on capturing the pawn on e5 and the pawn on c4. While this may not seem like a simple tactic for some of you guys, at the World Championship level, this is a fairly elementary tactic to see. In fact, judging by the video of the game, you can tell that Magnus noticed the tactic as soon as he played the move king d2, because he kind of froze and looked extremely nervous. But Anand also missed the tactic and in turn played a4. And now a visibly relieved Carlsen played king e2, and now the same trick doesn't work because after knight takes e5, rook takes g8, knight takes e4 does not come with check, and so Black doesn't win the 2 pawns. So this was an example of a tactical blunder, where sometimes players of any level will blunder a tactic that normally they would be able to see quite easily. In my opinion, this happens because the players are not fully focused in the position, and specifically, they are not looking for tactics in all positions. For example here, we have an endgame. There aren't too many tactics in the position, although it is a pretty complicated position. And I would imagine that before playing king d2, Magnus did not make some kind of blunder check, which we will talk about later in the video, and look for any potential tactics. If he stopped to think and look for these kinds of tactics, there's a very, very high chance that he would have spotted knight takes e5 and he could have avoided this blunder. And the same goes for Anand. After king d2, not playing knight takes e5 can also be considered a blunder because this is a tactic that is way, way below his level. And if he had stopped to think and look for any potential tactics in the position, I'm sure he would have found this as well. But of course, he's playing an endgame, he's slightly worse. He doesn't expect Carlsen to blunder such a simple trick, and so he wasn't looking for it and thus didn't find it. So this was an example of a tactical blunder. And now I'm going to show you guys another example of a tactical blunder that is very, very common in practice. This next example comes from one of the games of my students. Here Black is quite a decent position. He's got a solid center, and he has a lot of pressure against the knight on e4. And now adding to the pressure, Black here makes a blunder by playing the move knight f6. Can you see why this is a tactical blunder? If you want more time to think about it, feel free to stop the video and try to figure out how White can win material here. Well, the winning move for White is a simple capture, knight takes c5. The point is that Black's bishop on f5 is currently hanging. So if black recaptures the knight, then white takes the bishop on f5 for free. And if black takes the bishop on d3 first, then of course white recaptures with the knight and saves his extra piece. So in this example, black blundered a piece in one move. So what happened here? After the move knight f6, of course this breaks the connection between the rook on f8 and the bishop on f5, meaning this bishop is no longer adequately protected. Now this might not seem like a big deal and you won't always notice these kinds of things, but there's a few other elements in the position going on. Mainly, black's queen and bishop is lined up against white's queen and bishop. And in fact, black has a lot of pressure on this diagonal, as does white. Whenever there's so much tactical tension on one diagonal, it always opens things up for a potential tactic for either side. That means that both sides should have been very, very careful here and judge the consequences of every move as it relates to this diagonal. As you can see, there's a lot of tactical potential with all these pieces lined up against each other. And once again, I think this could have been avoided if black had done a quick tactics check or a blunder check, where before making your move on the board, you visualize making it, and then you immediately look for tactics for your opponent. Like you would if you were solving a puzzle and someone told you white to play and win material. You would look for all the forcing moves, the checks, the captures, the threats to the queen, and see if anything's working. And after about 30 seconds to a minute, if you don't see anything, then you can go ahead and make your move, and it's much less likely that you've committed a blunder. So now we'll move on to seeing other types of blunders. Here I want to share with you guys a couple of examples of what I would call a strategic blunder. So a tactical blunder is pretty easy to understand. A tactical blunder is when you lose a significant amount of material. 2 pawns, a piece, a rook, a queen, and so on. A strategic blunder is when you don't lose any material, but you give up control of a very important square, or you make a very, very unfavorable exchange. Basically, a strategic blunder is any move that really, really worsens your position without, of course, losing material. In this position on the board, white has a pretty impressive kingside pawn storm. And the most natural move here would be to play g5. Trying to break on the king side and open lines, and as you can see by the arrows and highlighted square, use this bishop on this diagonal, threatening the move g6. This would have been an excellent way for white to continue the attack, and here indeed white has a very, very strong position on the king side. If black takes this pawn, just to show you guys one interesting line, white can recapture, and if black continues taking, white can take back, bishop takes, and after queen h5, it's very likely that black is simply going to get mated here. White just has the open h-file and all of his pieces are involved in the attack. Instead of playing g5, if white had played the move h5, we can safely call this a strategic blunder because suddenly white has given up full control over the g5 square. And now it's much, much harder for white to get anything going on the king side. Now this seems like a silly move to play, but you'd be surprised. I see a lot of examples of players making very, very anti-positional moves where it seems like they're doing something right, but in fact they're actually giving up control of a very, very important square. And here, for example, after knight g5, black can immediately use this square, and suddenly black has a very decent defensive position on the king side. If white takes, black continues taking with pieces, and it's very, very hard for white to get anything going. His kingside pawns are completely stuck. So here's another example of a potential strategic blunder. This is a well-known game between two very strong players from the 1960s. Playing white is Bent Larsen, and he plays the move bishop b5. His opponent is the great world champion Bobby Fischer. So after the move bishop b5, white is of course attacking black's rook on e8. And the most natural move here seems to be bishop d7, in order to block the attack and develop a piece. But this move would be a pretty gross strategic blunder because black is exchanging the light squared bishop, which they desperately need in order to defend some squares on the king side, specifically the f5 square and the g4 square. So trading off these bishops gives white huge access to the light squares and makes black's position suddenly a lot worse. For example, after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, white would like to play knight f5. Currently, of course, this is impossible because of the pin along the e-file. Black can simply play queen takes f5. This would be a tactical blunder, of course. But instead, white can play the move long castles. And next, the knight is coming to f5 and is going to put a huge pressure on the bishop on g7, pawn on h6. As you can see, black's position on the king side is very vulnerable to attack. So instead, after the move bishop b5, Fischer played the very strange looking rook to d8. But this move is a lot stronger than the move bishop d7, since of course this doesn't allow white to take full control over the light squares on the king side. And in fact, things aren't so bad for black, since next move he can play a6 and kick white's bishop away from b5 anyways. Here's another example of a blunder that actually comes from one of my students' games. Here black has landed a very nice check, queen h4, which forced white to move his king to a very awkward square on d2. And as you can imagine, black might have some initiative here if he can open files and try to attack the king. So here white played the move queen e1. Of course, from white's point of view, he would love to exchange queens so that his king is actually pretty good in the center, since it will be an endgame, and won't be vulnerable with the queens off the board. And as you may have guessed here, black committed a strategic blunder by accepting the queen trade. His opponent was higher rated, and so he thought he should try to exchange queens and make a draw. But from the chess perspective, of course, trading queens is a huge mistake here. Black should keep the queens on the board at any cost. Either the move queen g5 or queen e7 is perfectly acceptable, following by trying to, again, open lines on the queen side, maybe taking the pawn on c4, playing a5, trying to open things up and look for tactics and combinations to give mate to the white king. So this was another example of a strategic blunder, where you exchange the wrong piece or give up control over a very important square. So now I want to give you guys a couple of tips on how you can avoid blunders in your games. The first tip I would give you is never to relax in a game until the game is over. That means the clocks are stopped, the score sheets are signed, hands shaken. I think a lot of blunders happen in positions where players think the game is over. Either they're making an easy draw or they're completely winning. So here's one such example. This game comes from a simul, and the player playing black thought that he had a very easy draw in the position and started making some very bad moves. He played e6, king g2, h5, king h3, e5, king h4. Black is not paying any attention at all to what white is doing, and after rook e6 and king g5, suddenly black's g-pawn is under attack and practically undefendable. White has brought his king in, activated the king, and now he's going to use the king, the rook on the 7th rank, and the nice dark squared bishop to win the game by breaking through on the king side. Black tried knight h7, and after king h6, as we can see, white has too much pressure on black's position, and black is simply lost here. For example, knight f8, bishop c5, white has threats of playing rook a8 and attacking the pinned knight on f8, or simply giving rook g7 check and then taking the knight outright, as well as capturing the g6 pawn. And in fact, black lost this game, mainly because they relaxed and started playing very bad moves, very weakening moves, and allowing white to get the initiative. So the first tip, of course, is never to relax. Always try to stay in full focus until the game is fully over. The next tip I want to give you is kind of a technical one. In this famous game, playing white as Deep Fritz, a very strong computer, against Vladimir Kramnik, the great world champion. Fritz's next move was knight takes f8, recapturing a rook and equalizing the material. And here, to the surprise of many spectators, Kramnik played the move queen e3, trying to trade queens, but of course allowing queen h7 mate. So a player of Kramnik's stature should of course never blunder a mate in one, even in a blitz game. But what happened here, I think, was he was focused on queen e3, trying to get into the endgame. He was rarely not even focusing on the position. So my advice is this: whenever a move is played, any move, always look for the new squares that the piece is now controlling. In chess, every time a piece is moved, that piece will then be controlling new squares. In this case, the knight from f8 is now taking control over the g6, h7, and d7 squares, which it didn't control before, as well as, of course, e6. It wasn't technically controlling e6 in the previous position. If you just have a slight mental awareness, just take stock of the new squares that the piece is controlling, this will allow you to avoid a lot of blunders, as you'll be able to spot your opponent's threats. In this case, of course, if Black had done this, he would notice that the knight is controlling h7, which means that there is now a very devastating mate threat on the board. So the simple advice is always look for the new squares that a piece is controlling as soon as it is moved. And our last example here takes place between two great players. Playing white is Larry Christensen, a grandmaster from the US and multiple-time US champion, and playing black is great world champion Anatoly Karpov. So black's last move was knight h5, attacking the bishop on f4. White played bishop e3, and now Karpov played bishop d6, continuing his development. And after white's next move, queen d1, Karpov was forced to resign since he had completely missed the simple double attack. White drops his queen back and attacks both the bishop and knight in one move. Black has no move to save the material. So the advice is this: in addition to being careful and always looking for tactics on every move, pay specific attention to which pieces are unprotected. In this case, both white and black should have noticed that the knight on h5 is kind of a strange piece. It's on the side of the board and it's undefended. This means that this knight is going to be tactically vulnerable in a lot of cases. After the move bishop d6, both sides again should have noticed that this bishop on d6 is also unprotected and thus also tactically vulnerable. If you keep in mind which pieces in the position are unprotected or are not protected enough or seem vulnerable, this will allow you to not only avoid a lot of blunders, but you'll also be able to spot a lot of tactics for yourself by exploiting your opponent's mistakes. So that wraps up today's lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And until next time, this has been International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and I'll see you next time. Take care.